Have you ever wondered what happened to those vegetable dishes that once ruled American dinner tables? The kind of sides that weren't just healthy, but soulful, comforting, and made with care in every bite. Long before microwaved veggies and packaged mixes took over, families leaned on recipes that transformed simple garden harvests into stars of the meal. These dishes weren't just food, they were memories simmered, baked, and passed from one generation to the next. In this video, we're diving into a treasure chest of forgotten vegetable recipes, from the creamy richness of baked zucchini casseroles to the crisp bite of fried okra, from tangy homemade sauerkraut to corn pudding with a fiery jalapeno twist. Each dish tells its own story, a reminder of a time when vegetables were celebrated, not just tolerated. And here's the thing, these aren't gourmet creations for fancy restaurants. These were family recipes, born out of gardens, shared at church potlucks, served at Sunday suppers, and remembered with a smile. They nourish not only the body but also the soul. So stick around as we bring these recipes back to life, one delicious bite at a time. And if nostalgia and food history are your thing, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss another trip back in time with us. Baked zucchini casserole. Picture this, it's the mid-1950s, and summer gardens are overflowing with zucchini. Families didn't waste a single harvest, they found creative ways to turn simple vegetables into hearty meals that could stretch across the dinner table. One of those creations was the baked zucchini casserole, a dish that was both humble and surprisingly elegant. This recipe often started with sliced zucchini, layered like green coins in a buttered dish. Families would fold in onions, sometimes breadcrumbs, and always a generous touch of cheese. The magic came from the baking. As the casserole cooked, the zucchini softened into something tender and almost creamy, while the top crisped up into a golden crust that smelled like pure comfort. It wasn't just about the flavor. This casserole represented a time when nothing was wasted. Home cooks leaned on seasonal produce, and zucchini was one of the most versatile vegetables around. It could be fried, sautéed, or baked into casseroles that filled stomachs without emptying wallets. For farm families and backyard gardeners, it was proof that abundance could be found in the simplest crops. The baked zucchini casserole also fit perfectly into mid-century potlucks and church gatherings. It was easy to make, easy to serve, and it carried that nostalgic feeling of food made with love. You didn't need fancy ingredients, just what you had on hand, transformed with a little creativity and care. Today, this dish has nearly disappeared, overshadowed by more modern takes on zucchini. But in its time, it was more than just a side, it was a reminder that vegetables could be hearty, comforting, and unforgettable. Creamed spinach. There was a time when spinach wasn't just a leafy green on the edge of a plate, it was the star of the meal. Creamed spinach, once a staple in American kitchens, took a humble vegetable and gave it richness, warmth, and comfort. The dish rose to popularity in the early 20th century, especially during the 1930s and 40s. Families were searching for ways to make inexpensive vegetables feel indulgent, and cream sauces were the answer. Fresh Auckland spinach was boiled down until tender, then folded into a silky mixture of butter, flour, and milk. A sprinkle of nutmeg or black pepper added depth, while the creamy texture turned spinach into something even kids could love. Creamed spinach wasn't reserved for fancy dinners, though steakhouses later made it a classic side. In small-town kitchens, it often appeared at Sunday suppers, church potlucks, or holiday tables. For many families, it carried a feeling of elegance without the cost, a way to transform garden greens into something worth savoring. Beyond taste, this dish reflected the American spirit of making do with what was available. Spinach was hardy, nutritious, and widely grown, and stretching it with a cream sauce meant no one left the table hungry. It was proof that even the simplest vegetables could feel like comfort food. Over time, convenience foods and fast meals pushed creamed spinach aside. But in its heyday, it was more than a side dish, it was a bridge between humble ingredients and timeless flavor, bringing warmth to dinner tables across America. Roasted Brussels sprouts. There was a time when Brussels sprouts had a reputation, and not always a good one. For decades, they were the vegetable kids dreaded, boiled until soft and bitter. But in their original form, roasted Brussels sprouts were a dish that told a very different story, one of warmth, simplicity, and seasonal abundance. In mid-century America, many families grew these tiny cabbage-like sprouts in backyard gardens. When fall arrived, stalks heavy with sprouts were harvested and brought straight into the kitchen. Roasting them in the oven wasn't just practical, it was transformative. With a drizzle of oil, a sprinkle of salt, and patience, these little green orbs turned golden and crisp, their leaves caramelizing into layers of nutty sweetness. Roasted Brussels sprouts were more than a side dish. They reflected an era when vegetables were given respect at the table. Instead of being hidden or forced, they were celebrated, served alongside Sunday roasts, Thanksgiving turkeys, or hearty casseroles. In many immigrant households, they echoed European traditions, reminding families of old country flavors that had been carried across the Atlantic. The dish also spoke to a time when food was deeply tied to the seasons. You couldn't find Brussels sprouts in a plastic bag at the grocery store year-round. You had to wait for autumn, when the air turned crisp and ovens once again became the heart of the home. Today, roasted Brussels sprouts have made a comeback in trendy restaurants, but their roots run deep in American kitchens of the past. They were proof that patience, fire, and a little care could turn even the most misunderstood vegetable into something families gathered around and remembered with fondness. Eggplant Parmesan bites. Back in the mid-20th century, when Italian-American cooking began weaving itself into the fabric of American kitchens, eggplant parmesan found its way to dinner tables. But tucked inside cookbooks and passed down at family gatherings was a smaller, forgotten cousin of that classic dish, eggplant parmesan bites. These little treasures started with thick slices of eggplant, breaded and fried until golden. Instead of being layered in a casserole dish, they were topped with a spoonful of tomato sauce and a sprinkle of cheese, then baked just long enough for the cheese to melt into a bubbly crown. What came out of the oven wasn't just food, it was joy in bite-sized form. Eggplant parmesan bites were perfect for family suppers, church socials, or evenings when neighbors dropped by unexpectedly. They carried the same warmth and richness of the full dish but in a form that was easy to share. For immigrant families, it was also a way to honor tradition while adapting to American life, making old-world recipes fit into new-world gatherings. This dish also spoke to frugality and creativity. Eggplant was inexpensive, filling, and plentiful in gardens. Stretching it into small bites meant more people could enjoy it without stretching a budget. Every crisp edge and melted bite carried with it the spirit of making the most out of what you had. Over time, eggplant parmesan became a staple, but the bite-sized version quietly slipped away, replaced by faster, more convenient party foods. Yet for those who remember, eggplant parmesan bites weren't just snacks, they were a reminder of community, tradition, and the joy of gathering around food made with love. Baked potato salad. When most people think of potato salad, They imagine the chilled, mayonnaise-covered version served at summer picnics. But tucked inside the pages of old community cookbooks was a lesser-known gem, the baked potato salad. Unlike its cold cousin, this dish was warm, hearty, and comforting, making it perfect for family dinners and potlucks during cooler months. The recipe usually began with baked potatoes, their skins crisp and centers fluffy. Instead of boiling them soft, families baked the potatoes first, giving them a deeper, almost smoky flavor. Once cooled slightly, they were chopped and folded into a mixture of sour cream, shredded cheese, green onions, and sometimes bacon. The whole dish was placed in the oven once more, bubbling until the cheese melted into a golden, gooey topping. This wasn't just a side dish, it was a bridge between two American classics, baked potatoes and potato salad. It carried the comfort of the oven with the communal spirit of a dish meant to be shared. For busy homemakers of the 1960s and 70s, it was also practical. You could prepare it ahead of time, pop it in the oven, and serve it hot without fuss. Baked potato salad became a potluck favorite in small towns, where recipes were swapped on handwritten cards and every casserole dish carried a family's signature touch. It was hearty enough to feed a crowd yet simple enough to make with ingredients already in the pantry. Over the years, as traditional potato salad stayed popular, the baked version slowly slipped into obscurity. But in its prime, it wasn't just about potatoes, it was about warmth, sharing, and the joy of turning something familiar into something unforgettable. Marinated beets. There was a time when beets weren't just a side note on the plate, they were a vibrant, jewel-toned centerpiece of American family meals. One of the most cherished ways they were served was as marinated beets, a dish that combined simplicity with elegance and managed to brighten even the most modest of tables. The process was straightforward but filled with care. Freshly boiled or roasted beets were peeled and sliced into rhubarb rounds, then bathed in a tangy marinade of vinegar, sugar, salt, and spices. Sometimes onions were added for a little bite, and the beets would rest overnight, soaking up every bit of flavor. By the time they were served, each slice was tender, sweet, and tangy, with a sparkle of flavor that stood out against heavier dishes. Marinated beets became especially popular during the 1940s and 50s, when home preservation was still a way of life. They stored well in jars, making them perfect for families who wanted to stretch the harvest through winter. For immigrant families from Eastern Europe, the dish carried deep cultural roots, reminding them of traditions back home where beets were more than food, they were heritage. At church suppers, picnics, and Sunday dinners, a glass dish filled with marinated beets brought color and variety to the table. They were nutritious, affordable, and endlessly adaptable, proving that even humble vegetables could feel festive. Over time, with the rise of convenience foods, marinated beets began to fade from everyday kitchens. Yet in their heyday, they weren't just a salad, they were a symbol of thrift, creativity, and the beauty of turning the earth's simplest gifts into something lasting and full of flavor. Homemade sauerkraut. Long before refrigeration and grocery store shelves lined with canned goods, families relied on one simple but powerful method of preservation: fermentation. At the heart of this tradition stood homemade sauerkraut, a dish that carried both survival and flavor in every crunchy bite. The process was as old as time yet beautifully simple. Fresh cabbage, often grown in backyard gardens, was shredded finely and packed tightly into crocks or jars. Sprinkled with salt and pressed down, the cabbage released its juices, creating the perfect environment for natural fermentation. Over days or weeks, it transformed into sauerkraut, tangy, crisp, and full of life. For many immigrant families, especially those from German and Eastern European backgrounds, sauerkraut wasn't just food. It was heritage brought across the ocean and kept alive in American kitchens. It appeared on tables as a side dish with sausages, layered into casseroles, or even tucked into sandwiches. Beyond taste, it represented thrift and ingenuity, turning a single humble cabbage into a food supply that could last all winter. In the 1930s and 40s, when resources were scarce, sauerkraut offered both nourishment and comfort. Rich in vitamins, it helped families stay healthy, especially in cold months when fresh produce was limited. Every jar on the shelf wasn't just sustenance, it was security. Over time, store-bought versions replaced the homemade kind, and the art of fermenting cabbage slowly faded. But in its prime, homemade sauerkraut wasn't only about preservation. It was about family traditions, about the patience to wait while flavors deepened, and about the satisfaction of tasting something made entirely by hand. Today, it stands as a forgotten yet powerful reminder of how simple food, prepared with care, once carried families through hard times and celebrations alike. Green bean almondine. There was once a time when vegetables were dressed up with elegance, not just boiled and forgotten on the plate. Green bean almondine, or almondine, as the French called it, was one of those dishes that gave simple green beans a touch of sophistication. It may have sounded fancy, but in mid-20th century America, it became a staple at family gatherings, holiday feasts, and even everyday dinners. The recipe was delightfully simple. Fresh green beans were blanched until tender crisp, then tossed in butter until glossy. A handful of toasted almonds was scattered over the top, adding a nutty crunch that elevated the dish from ordinary to memorable. Sometimes a squeeze of lemon or a sprinkle of parsley was added, bringing brightness to every bite. What made green bean almondine so special wasn't just the taste, it was the sense of occasion it carried. In an era when many meals were built around casseroles and heavy starches, this dish felt lighter, fresher, and a bit more refined. It became a popular choice for Thanksgiving and Christmas tables, where cooks wanted something colorful and crisp to balance the richness of roasts and gravies. For homemakers flipping through Betty Crocker and Good Housekeeping magazines, green bean almondine also represented a new wave of cooking, one that borrowed from European traditions but was adapted for American kitchens. It showed that vegetables didn't need to be plain or hidden under cheese, they could shine with just a few thoughtful touches. Over time, convenience replaced ritual, and frozen green bean casseroles took the spotlight. Yet green bean almondine remains a reminder of a time when even the simplest side dish carried grace, flavor, and a little sparkle of celebration. Corn pudding with jalapenos. Corn has always been at the heart of American cooking, from native traditions to pioneer kitchens and beyond. But tucked inside community cookbooks and family recipe boxes was a dish that blended comfort with a little kick: corn pudding with jalapenos. It wasn't just food, it was warmth, spice, and tradition baked into one. Corn pudding had been around for generations, a creamy mix of corn, milk, eggs, and butter baked until golden. It was beloved in the South and Midwest, often served at holidays, church suppers, and Sunday dinners. But by the mid-20th century, cooks began adding jalapenos, bringing in a fiery twist that reflected the growing influence of Southwestern flavors. The recipe itself was simple yet magical. Sweet corn kernels, sometimes fresh from the cob, sometimes canned, were stirred into a custard-like base. Diced jalapenos were folded in, giving just enough heat to balance the sweetness. As it baked, the top browned slightly while the inside stayed rich and creamy, a texture somewhere between cornbread and soufflé. What made corn pudding with jalapenos special wasn't only taste. It represented how American food evolved, how traditions adapted and blended with new cultural influences. A dish born of thrift and comfort suddenly carried boldness, showing that even humble corn could surprise you. Families loved it because it was both familiar and exciting. It sat proudly next to turkey on Thanksgiving, brisket at barbecues, or fried chicken at Sunday meals. Every spoonful was a reminder of how creativity and heritage worked hand in hand at the dinner table. Today, this spicy twist on a classic has almost vanished from everyday kitchens. But in its heyday, corn pudding with jalapenos wasn't just a side, it was a celebration of flavor, community, and the American spirit of reinvention. Fried okra bites. In the kitchens of the American South, there was one vegetable that stirred both pride and tradition: okra. Known for its unique texture and resilience in hot climates, okra was a staple in gardens and on dinner tables. And while stewed okra often appeared in gumbos and soups, nothing captured hearts quite like fried okra bites. The recipe was as straightforward as it was irresistible. Fresh okra pods were sliced into small rounds, dipped into cornmeal or flour, and fried until golden brown. Each piece turned into a crisp little nugget, crunchy on the outside and tender within. Seasoned with just a pinch of salt or spices, they were the kind of snack that disappeared by the handful before they ever made it to the table. Fried okra bites weren't just food, they were community. They showed up at church potlucks, backyard cookouts, and family reunions. In rural towns, where summers stretched long and hot, bowls of fried okra carried the comfort of home and the flavor of tradition. They were simple enough for everyday meals, yet special enough to stand alongside fried chicken, biscuits, and gravy. For many, the dish also carried echoes of heritage. African, Native American, and Southern traditions all shaped the way okra was cooked and celebrated. Frying it into bite-sized pieces was not just about taste, it was about preserving culture, making a vegetable with a tricky reputation into something universally loved. Over the years, fried okra bites have faded from many modern kitchens, overshadowed by fast food and convenient snacks. But in their heyday, they were more than crispy vegetables. They were edible memories, crunchy little pieces of history that reminded families of summers, laughter, and the joy of sharing food made with love.